They said it was just about unpaid fees. That's the excuse the HOA used when they sent bulldozers rolling onto my family's property, leveling a cabin that had stood by the lake for 3 generations. In a single afternoon, they reduced memories, heirlooms, and years of sacrifice to nothing but dust and splinters. But here's what the HOA didn't know. My family doesn't back down, and we're not powerless. In fact, we're trained to fight back in ways they never saw coming. What happens when an overreaching HOA picks a battle with the wrong family? When I first bought the lake cabin, it wasn't about luxury or appearances. It was about peace. Tucked between towering pines and a quiet stretch of water, the cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside. But to me, it was everything. It was where I planned family cookouts, where my kids could grow up learning to fish, and where weekends meant laughter echoing off the lake instead of car horns and deadlines. The community around the lake looked picture-perfect too. At first glance, it felt like the kind of neighborhood where people waved when you drove by, and the Homeowners Association promised to keep things orderly so that property values stayed high. To someone just moving in, that sounded reasonable. Who wouldn't want tidy lawns and safe streets? But beneath the surface, there was a tension I couldn't quite name. The HOA board was made up of a small group of people who seemed to live for rules. They carried clipboards, sent out constant reminders, and acted as though every minor detail, how tall your grass grew, where you parked your car, even the color of your shutters, was a personal crusade. Still, I brushed it off. I wasn't here to make waves. I was here to build memories. For the first few months, life at the lake felt like the dream I had been chasing. Friends visited, the kids played in the water until sunset, and evenings ended with the crackle of a fire pit. But little did I know, the same HOA that promised to protect this community would soon become the very reason everything I loved about that cabin and the peace it gave me was put in jeopardy. At first, the HOA's demands came in little envelopes that looked harmless enough. A letter slipped into my mailbox with a polite but stern reminder about the appearance standards for community homes. The grass around the cabin, they said, was uneven and might lower neighborhood value. It stung, mostly because I'd spent hours cutting it myself the weekend before. But I shrugged it off. A warning wasn't worth losing sleep over. Then another letter came. This time, it wasn't about the lawn. It was about the boat dock, an old wooden structure my grandfather had built with his own hands decades earlier. They claimed it didn't meet safety code. The truth? It wasn't shiny or new like some of the others along the lake, but it was solid. It was part of our family history. Still, the HOA slapped me with a fine. Not a small one either. Hundreds of dollars for non-compliance. It didn't stop there. Week after week, more notices arrived. One demanded I paint the cabin's shutters a different color. Another fined me for leaving a canoe too close to the shoreline. They even complained about where my kids' bicycles were left when they came to visit. Each envelope carried a new accusation, a new fee, a new attempt to chip away at my peace. And no matter how quickly I addressed one complaint, 2 more would appear. As though they were inventing reasons just to keep me on edge, neighbors began whispering about the board. Some said the president of the HOA was obsessed with control. Others admitted they had been fined for absurd reasons too, like hanging Christmas lights too early or having the wrong style of mailbox. But no one dared challenge them outright. The fear of retaliation was too strong. I began to feel it too. Every drive to the cabin came with a knot in my stomach. Would there be another notice waiting? Another fine I couldn't justify? The pressure built until one day I received the letter that changed everything. The HOA claimed I had failed to pay required fees. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I kept records, every receipt, every canceled check. I knew I was up to date. But according to them, I was delinquent. Not just by a little, by thousands. They insisted I had ignored multiple payment requests that had never reached me. And with that claim came the biggest threat yet: legal action. The accusation wasn't just insulting, it was dangerous. Because if the HOA could prove I was delinquent, they could file liens, strip me of rights, even force a foreclosure. My family's cabin, my sanctuary, could be taken away over fees I didn't even owe. I tried calling, emailing, even showing up at the HOA office with proof in hand. They didn't care. They brushed me off, told me to settle it with the treasurer, then ignored me altogether. That's when the harassment escalated into something darker. My mailbox began filling with duplicate notices, some marked with red stamps screaming final warning. The fines grew higher, the threats bolder. I noticed unfamiliar cars parked near the cabin, late at night, as if someone was watching, waiting for me to make a wrong move. It felt less like a homeowners association and more like an organized campaign to drive me out. And then came the first official court notice. According to their filing, I owed back fees that stretched over years, more than the cabin itself was worth. My jaw dropped when I saw the amount. They were painting me as a chronic offender, someone who had ignored rules, refused payment, and mocked authority. It wasn't just false, it was character assassination. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. One weekend, I arrived at the cabin to find a bright orange notice nailed to the front door. Property in violation, demolition authorized. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, but as I read through the fine print, my blood ran cold. The HOA was claiming full authority to remove unsafe structures on community land. My cabin, my grandfather's cabin, was now officially marked for destruction. Panic set in. I tried everything. Called lawyers, contacted the county, even begged for an emergency hearing. But the HOA had timed it perfectly. They pushed the demolition order through during a holiday week when most offices were closed. The clock was ticking, and I was powerless to stop it. The following Friday morning, I woke up to the distant growl of heavy machinery. I drove to the cabin as fast as I could, only to see bulldozers lined up at the edge of the property. Men in hard hats were already chaining off the driveway. My pleas meant nothing. I was just another non-compliant homeowner. Within hours, the cabin was gone, torn apart, splinter by splinter, until nothing was left but rubble. Watching that demolition was like watching my childhood burn. Every memory, the fishing trips, the late-night fires, the summers with my kids, crushed beneath steel and concrete. And the HOA stood there, arms crossed, faces smug, convinced they had won. But what they didn't realize was that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Because while I stood there in shock, holding back rage and grief, I knew something they didn't. My family wasn't just a regular family. We weren't helpless. And what the HOA had done wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. The day the bulldozers leveled my family's cabin should have been the end of the story. For most homeowners, that would have been the final blow, the moment of defeat. And that's exactly what the HOA expected. They thought they had erased me, wiped me off the map, made me another cautionary tale whispered about in neighborhood meetings. But they had no idea who they had picked a fight with. Because what the HOA didn't know was that my entire family worked in federal law enforcement. Not just one or two of us, my siblings, my cousins, even my father. Each of us carried different badges, different specialties, But one thing united us. We knew the law inside and out, and we knew how to use it. In the hours after the demolition, while I sifted through the broken remains of my grandfather's cabin, my phone buzzed non-stop. My family had heard what happened, and they were furious. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about abuse of power, corruption, and fraud, and we weren't about to let it slide. The very next week, we started pulling strings. My brother, who worked in federal investigations, dug into the HOA's finances. What he uncovered was staggering. The so-called fees they had accused me of neglecting weren't just fabricated. They were part of a much larger pattern. The board had been inflating charges, inventing fines, and funneling money into accounts that didn't match any legitimate community expenses. The HOA wasn't just overreaching, they were running a racket. Meanwhile, my cousin in the Justice Department filed urgent motions to preserve evidence, freezing the HOA's accounts before they could cover their tracks. Another family member contacted state regulators, tipping them off to building code violations and illegal contracting practices. Piece by piece, we built a case, not just to defend myself, but to dismantle the very people who thought they could destroy my life. The board members had no idea what was coming. They strutted into community meetings with smug smiles, brushing off whispers of an investigation. They still believed they were untouchable, protected by the authority of their titles and the silence of fearful neighbors. But behind the scenes, subpoenas were being prepared, warrants were being signed, and investigators were lining up interviews with anyone who had ever been fined or bullied by the HOA. And then came the breaking point. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when the board gathered for their monthly meeting. They expected it to be like all the others, a chance to gloat, to scold, to remind the community who held the power. But this time, the room was packed with more than nervous homeowners. Plainclothes agents filled the back rows, clipboards in hand. Cameras recorded every word. And at the front of the room, my family stood united, waiting. The president of the HOA barely got through the opening agenda before the first agent stepped forward, flashing a badge. His voice carried across the hall as he read the list of charges: fraud, embezzlement, illegal property seizure, destruction of private property. The board's faces drained of color, their arrogance melted into shock. The same people who had towered over homeowners with threats and fines now stammered like children caught in a lie. Neighbors gasped, some whispered in disbelief, others sat frozen, afraid to even move. And then, slowly, the tide shifted. People began nodding, murmuring, even clapping. For years, they had lived under the HOA's thumb. Now they were watching justice unfold in real time. The board president tried to argue, claiming the demolition had been lawful and the fees documented. But my brother stepped forward, dropping a thick folder onto the table with a sound that echoed like a gavel strike. Inside was every falsified notice, every doctored ledger, every shred of evidence proving they had fabricated debts to justify their campaign against me. The president's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, realizing there was no escape. The climax of that moment didn't come from shouting or chaos. It came from silence. The silence of a room full of neighbors finally seeing the truth. The silence of power shifting from corrupt officials back to the community they had terrorized. And the silence of board members being led away, one by one, under the weight of their own arrogance. But for me, the real turning point wasn't watching the HOA crumble. It was seeing the relief on my neighbors' faces. People who had been fined for planting flowers, penalized for holiday decorations, threatened with foreclosure for nonsense fees, they were finally free, My personal fight had ignited something bigger, something that went beyond my demolished cabin. It was about dismantling a system of abuse and showing that no matter how small a community seemed, no one was above the law. Still, as powerful as that day was, it wasn't the end. The real battle would play out in court, in depositions, in months of hearings where every detail of the HOA's corruption was dragged into the light. And while I had my family behind me, the road ahead was far from easy. The board wasn't going down without a fight. They had money, lawyers, and years of intimidation on their side. But so did we. The climax of this story wasn't just a single confrontation. It was the beginning of the endgame. The board thought they had destroyed me, but in reality, they had unleashed a force far greater than they could comprehend. And as I walked out of that community hall, past the neighbors who now looked at me not with pity, but with pride, I realized the truth. My cabin might have been reduced to rubble, but the fight had just begun. The HOA had made their boldest move, and now it was our turn. And trust me, when a family of federal agents decides to fight back, there's no such thing as mercy. The days following the board's public humiliation felt surreal. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of dread pressing on my chest. But as anyone who's ever faced corruption knows, victory doesn't happen in a single night. The real fight moved into the courts, where every lie, every fabricated fee, every abuse of power was dragged into the light for the world to see. The lawsuits piled up fast. Class actions from homeowners who had suffered under years of fines. Civil claims for damages, harassment, and emotional distress. Criminal charges filed by prosecutors who, armed with the evidence my family uncovered, had no shortage of ammunition. I wasn't just a plaintiff anymore. I had become a symbol. Neighbors who once whispered their complaints in hushed tones now stood beside me in court, no longer afraid of retaliation. People I barely knew came forward with stories of their own. A single mother nearly forced into foreclosure over a $50 landscaping violation. A retired couple who'd paid thousands in bogus fines just to keep their peace. A veteran who had been fined for flying his flag incorrectly. Every testimony added another nail in the coffin of the HOA's credibility. The board members, once smug and untouchable, were now scrambling. Their lawyers tried everything: delays, counterclaims, even painting me as a troublemaker who had brought the mess upon myself. But facts are stubborn things. And every time they tried to twist the narrative, we brought receipts, bank statements, emails, meeting minutes doctored to hide illegal votes. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became. The HOA hadn't been protecting the community. They had been exploiting it. And then came the ruling that changed everything. The judge declared the demolition of my cabin unlawful, a gross abuse of power carried out under fraudulent pretenses. The HOA was ordered to compensate me not only for the value of the cabin, but for punitive damages. The amount was staggering. Enough to rebuild, enough to restore what was lost, enough to make a point. But more importantly, the ruling didn't stop there. The board members themselves faced personal accountability. Some were fined, others barred from ever serving on an HOA again. A few even faced prison sentences for embezzlement and fraud. The image of them being escorted out of the courthouse, stripped of their authority and reputation, was more satisfying than I could have imagined. But the true victory wasn't in money or punishment. It was in change. The homeowners voted to dissolve the old HOA entirely. In its place, we built a new system, one rooted in transparency, fairness, and accountability. No more hidden meetings, no more arbitrary fines, Every rule was debated openly, every expense documented. Neighbors who had once been divided by fear began working together, united by the scars of what we had endured. As for me, I rebuilt, not just the cabin, but the spirit of what it represented. Piece by piece, plank by plank, the new cabin rose from the ashes of the old. This time I built it stronger, with my family by my side. And when it was finished, I invited the entire community for a cookout. We laughed, we ate, we shared stories of battles fought and won. It wasn't just a housewarming, it was a declaration. The lake was no longer a place of fear. It was home again. Still, there were scars. Every time I looked at the cabin, I remembered the day it was torn down. The sight of bulldozers crushing my memories would never fully leave me. But those scars became part of the story, not of loss, but of resilience. Because sometimes what's taken from you can be rebuilt. Sometimes injustice becomes the spark for something greater. The impact spread beyond our little community. Local news stations covered the downfall of the HOA, broadcasting it as a cautionary tale of power run amok. Lawmakers took notice, debating reforms to prevent other associations from wielding unchecked authority. Emails poured in from strangers across the country, people trapped in their own HOA nightmares, telling me our story gave them hope to fight back. And that, more than anything, was the real legacy of what happened. It wasn't just about my cabin. It wasn't just about my family of federal agents or the crooked board members who thought they could get away with anything. Looking back now, I realize the HOA thought they could erase me by tearing down a building. But they didn't understand that walls and wood art would hold power. It's the people inside them, the memories, the courage, the refusal to bow down to bullies. That's what lasts. So when I sit on the porch of my rebuilt,